This week, we're examining other stories, deliberate forgeries that have taken on a life of their own, contributing much confusion within what is known as the truth movement. Many such rumors are iconic, and good people have invested much energy promoting these legends. But legends they are. In some cases, well-meaning folks thought that by putting those frauds into circulation, they were helping impart greater truths that people need to know. Well, there are some of us who believe we already have enough facts at our disposal to make the important points that need to be made. We don't need to invent stories to make our case. Other stories had less than benevolent motivations behind them. They were concocted for the very purpose of muddying the waters of serious research into major issues of our time. Now, I am really going to upset some people by mentioning some of the notable forgeries. I'm going to go through a list of them with you, and a lot of them, many of you are familiar with, and I'd be willing to bet you one of my favorite guns, or one of my favorite sword canes, or one of my favorite daggers, that the likelihood is that some of you out there have passed on some of these forgeries, these fraudulent stories that have become commonly discussed and written about and quoted in the patriot media, in the independent media, in the white separatist media, whatever you want to call it. Now, a lot of these stories, as I say, they sound good. They sound good and they meet with the approval of many, but the stories themselves just aren't true. Well, I'm here to tell you, unfortunately, that I personally know one of the people who is responsible, according to some pretty good information that's come to my attention. I know one of the individuals who was responsible for initiating two of these fraudulent stories. And evidently, from what I'm told, he once told somebody else that yes, indeed, he had created these stories because he thought they would be good to get a message across. Well, I don't think that's true, folks, as I say. I don't think that's true. But I'm going to start off with the least interesting one, but it's one that's always around. We constantly hear an excerpt from a speech by David Rockefeller thanking the media for withholding news reports on Bilderberg meetings. Now, yes, folks, yes, the media does withhold news reports on Bilderberg. That's absolutely true. The Spotlight and now American Free Press have covered Bilderberg for years and have frequently commented on that, but I'm here to tell you that never once did Jim Tucker or any responsible person that I know of who did any effort to investigate Bilderberg ever come out of a Bilderberg meeting with a quote from David Rockefeller thanking the media for withholding news reports on Bilderberg. But somebody crafted up some little speech by David Rockefeller, not even a whole speech, just that one quote, and put it out there. And I'm here to tell you, folks, when somebody wrote an article mentioning Bilderberg for American Free Press a few years ago, guess what? That quotation popped up in the story. Usually I would stand up and say, oh, take that quote out of there. That's a phony. That's a fraud. That makes us look foolish. But I didn't want to hurt the author's feelings. And I didn't feel like arguing the point. So it ran. But that doesn't really matter, I suppose, because, well, that quote's all over the internet. Who conjured up that quote? They sure came up with a good one. They must be sitting back laughing when they see that quote popping up. Okay, some more notable forgeries that have taken on a life of their own and which people swear by. Oh, this is going to upset you, folks. The spurious interview with Harold Wallace Rosenthal, in which he supposedly unveils insider secrets of the Zionist conspiracy. That's a fraud, folks. That's a fraud. Total concoction. Now, I'm not saying there isn't a Zionist conspiracy and that the Zionists don't do the kind of things he says that they do. Oh, yes, they do, folks. But that interview is a fraud, folks.
Des, can you tell us a little bit about your meeting with Walter White? Walter White is he's the editor who brought forward the Harold Rosenthal interview, which really lays bare the so-called Jewish banker covert control of the world. Go ahead, tell us the story.
I first read that document about 30 years ago, and I was very impressed by it. However, if anything, it seemed a little bit too perfect. It was allegedly the confessions of a man named Rosenthal, who it was said was one of Senator Jacob Javits' right-hand men. And apparently in the interview, he spilled the beans on what the plans of the Jewish cabal were. At that time, another author in the East Coast called me up and asked me if I'd go out to some of the Hollywood area, Glendale area, on the north side of Los Angeles, and have a talk to White. White had agreed with them that if they sent somebody out, he would allow them to hear the original recording of the interview. So I was intrigued by that possibility, and with a friend, I went out there and spent about an hour in his living room. He brought us in, and he sat us down, and he said, "I'll leave this recorder here, and I'll turn it on, and then I'll go upstairs. I've got some work to do." So he turned the machine on, and my friend and I listened to approximately 45, 50 minutes of the recording. And almost right from the beginning, I said, there's something wrong here. So in some places, it became very heated, and the two individuals often stopped and went back and corrected themselves. This happened maybe a half a dozen times or so. I can't remember right now. However, when the whole thing was over, we thanked him for letting us hear the recording, and then we went. And as we were walking down the driveway, I turned to my friend and I said, "What do you think?" He said, no way. It was obviously staged. And having listened to it and having thought about it ever since, for probably a quarter of a century, I still come to the conclusion that it actually was staged, that they were reading a pre-written script. And whoever made it, well, presumably it was White himself. He apparently didn't have the savvy or the wherewithal or the intelligence to see how anybody listening to it would obviously question the long pauses, and would also question the constant going back and repeating things and correcting themselves. So you're saying that the Rosenthal interview is a fraud? Is that what you're saying? That's what I'm saying. Yes. I wrote to somebody fairly recently, within the last couple of years, who had been publishing it and who was advertising it, and I brought it to their attention. I can't even remember who it was now, and they contacted me later and they said, you probably have a point there, and probably as a result of that, he ceased carrying it. But
what was your impression of Walter White? Do you know much about him?
Who?
Do you know much about Walter White?
Very, very little. I only met him on that one occasion, and I may have heard him mentioned on and off maybe half a dozen times.
You know, I'll tell you, I used to know a guy, Walter White, in Los Angeles, who used to write, and he was a pretty good guy, but even though I don't know whether I go into this false kidnapping he went through, but anyhow, he wrote this so-called secret memo where there was an agreement with this Jew speaking with David Javits, you remember, from New York, the Senator Jacob Javits.
Right.
And they laid the whole Jewish takeover.
Yeah.
Huh?
Rosenthal, I think his name was.
Yeah, right. That was a total scam. That was not true at all. I knew the guy. He dreamed it up and wrote it down. Later, what he did was he sort of liked to play around with his wife. I can talk about him now. He's dead, I guess. But anyhow, incidentally, his wife used to work for Gerald L.K. Smith. But anyhow, he wrote this stuff up, and then, and I got a call from a buddy of his one day and said he'd been kidnapped. And I said, at that time I ran the Klan in California. They said, will you help us find him? I said, well, I don't know. It's going to be, L.A.'s a big city. We'll try. Well, anyhow, it went on for days, and somebody came up with the idea that the JDL got him. And that was probably injected by the police or something. And they went out, and there's 2 or 3 Klansmen, without any authority from anybody, went out to this establishment run by a man by the name of Irv Rubin, who was the same name as the guy who ran the JDL. And they handed him a gun and pointed him to the store and go in and blow the guy away. Well, the minute he left the car with the gun, the cops surrounded him and took him away. Those guys got, 5 or 10 years on that deal. And then it turned out that Walter White had never been kidnapped at all. He'd been in a motel with some young chickie down by the border. So you see, this is I go back so far with the right wing. My closet door is warped from all the skeletons that are in there, and it tickles me that some of these guys come up with stuff about the old days, and I know all about the old days. So you gotta be real careful on information. You know what I mean?
The supposedly secret speech by Rabbi Emanuel Rabinovich in Budapest in 1952. Fraud. I know the guy that made it up. In fact, he admitted to somebody else I know that he made it up. He admitted this to the late H. Keith Thompson. Not that H. Keith Thompson is the guy who made it up, but he admitted it to H. Keith Thompson, who was also a friend of mine. Here's another one that Henry Makow has quoted this one frequently. The long-hailed Red Symphony book attributed to Joseph Landowski, purportedly recounting the interrogation of a Soviet official named Rakovsky. Well, now, again, some of the details in that may be correct. And there was somebody named Rakovsky. And he made statements at various times that jibe with what appears in the book. But that interrogation, that was made up, folks. It was the guy who made it up was the late George Knupfer, Knupfer. And from what I've heard, he was a good fellow. I knew people that knew him, but he made that up. Here's another one that was made up, and it's been widely quoted. A racial program for the 20th century. Was supposedly penned by Israel Cohen. Well, yes, folks, there's no doubt about it that the Jews have tried to cause racial disunity in America. But the famous essay, A Racial Program for the 20th Century, was a fraud. And then here's another one. Freemason Albert Pike's assertion that 3 world wars were planned in advance. Well, Albert Pike was a Freemason, and he was a troublemaker, and he was a bad, bad man. And Freemasons do help create wars and revolutions. And while that theme may well be true that 3 world wars were planned in advance, the Pike quotation is a fraud. And here's a more recent one, a much-heralded report supposedly approved by U.S. intelligence agencies predicting the demise of Israel. Well, That whole scenario for the demise of Israel essentially is what I wrote about in my book, Confessions of an Anti-Semite. 10-point dissection of that possibility. But somebody took the same theme, the same idea, not necessarily from my book, but they put it out there, and a lot of people I know thought that that report was for real, folks, but it wasn't. It wasn't. It wasn't. It wasn't. Now, there are other methods of spreading falsehood, disguised by others sometimes clever but sinister means. An increasingly popular scenario for inserting disinformation into popular discourse has been the discovery of hidden diaries and other documents that are described as the musings of dead Nazis or dead CIA officers or dead international bankers. However, the careful examination of these documents, if you know what you're looking for, it'll reveal that they are fictions based on carefully crafted interweaving of a variety of previously published material freely accessible in other literature. In other words, these people are really clever writers who have managed to assimilate a lot of information into their own minds, and then they weave them into really interesting stories, but they just ain't true. In other cases, you'll find very real news stories or existing documents that have been altered or otherwise misrepresented as to their meaning. For example, a couple years ago, I went through this with right here on RBN. There was one innocuous media report about the corrupt Goldman Sachs banking empire. Well, an internet rumor monger slightly amended that media story from the mainstream media. They amended that story to include the claim that the purported losses at Goldman Sachs had been channeled to secret bank accounts in Israel. Folks, I have no brief, as you well know if you're a regular listener, I have no brief for the international bankers of any kind, whether they're Jewish international bankers, most of which international bankers are indeed Jewish, whether they're Jews or Gentiles, whatever. And I have no brief for the state of Israel, the gangster state of Israel. And it's entirely believable that Goldman Sachs stole investors' money, stole bank money, and channeled it to bank accounts in Israel. I absolutely believe that's entirely possible, folks. But the relevant part of the story that was so widely discussed and that people called in here to talk about was a fabrication. It was inserted into a real, quote-unquote, real news story from the Internet, so that didn't have that originally, but it was repeated. The story with the insertion was repeated everywhere, and people were picking up on it. And I remember one of our callers called in and said, well, Mike, don't you understand that that's really what happened, and that's what's important? No, what I understand is we need to deal with the facts. We don't need to create rumors. We don't need to create fanciful stories that sound good, because sometimes we get caught. And I don't mean we in the royal sense, because I don't fabricate. Here's the one that's really going to upset a lot of people, of the frauds that have been out there floating around for years. The legendary executive order by John F. Kennedy creating U.S. notes that was supposedly reversed after JFK's assassination by Lyndon Johnson. Well, folks, there was an executive order. It had nothing to do with U.S. notes. A few fanciful people have tried to stretch, when confronted with the facts, few fanciful people have tried to stretch it and say, well, yes, in fact, it really was going against the Federal Reserve. But no, folks, let me tell you in a nutshell here what the story on this is. And unfortunately, I'm sorry to tell you, the spotlight played a major role in getting this false story out there. Sorry to tell you that. We had a credulous lad on the staff, not the one I refer to all the time here in this program. Credulous lad who inserted a small, brief item into what we call the news miss page. If you're familiar with American Free Press, it's just little news items about 2 inches in length, just little brief items. Well, some newsletter promoter somewhere had a newsletter out claiming that John F. Kennedy had put out an executive order issuing U.S. notes into the economy, and that Lyndon Johnson reversed it immediately after Kennedy's assassination. Well, this credulous lad on the Spotlight staff put that in the news miss column. Well, Willis Carto, the publisher, said, I want some facts on this. After it had been published, he said, I'd like to see the facts on this. And he put the guy who in charge of the research department into looking into it, and he discovered that, in fact, that executive order had nothing whatsoever to do with U.S. notes. Further research into the matter discovered that, in fact, there was a general policy that had been enacted into law by Congress going back to like the 1880s or something like that, saying that every few years the Congress and the Treasury that they were required to put U.S. notes into circulation. So this would have happened, whoever would have been president. It happened all the time. Okay. Well, we published a correction the next issue of the Spotlight and published the accurate details. And believe me, it upset a lot of people. People said, oh, no, that can't be true. It has to be true that Kennedy was assassinated because he reversed, or because Kennedy was assassinated by the Federal Reserve because of this issue. Well, I'll tell you what happened, folks. Jim Marrs, and don't confuse him with Tex Marrs, Jim Marrs wrote his book Crossfire, and in his book Crossfire about the Kennedy assassination, which became a major bestseller, and it's an interesting book, a lot of interesting material in it. In that book, he cited the story about the Federal Reserve and the U.S. note and gave it widespread circulation. And guess what? If you look in that book, you'll see he cited the article in the Spotlight that we had to correct the next week. Oh, boy. Well, subsequent to that, I've written about that, and I wrote about it in the Spotlight, and got angry letters from people who said, oh, it had to be true. But no, folks, it's not true. And there have been other independent people who've looked into it, and these are not agents of the Federal Reserve, folks, no. In fact, a friend of mine, here's what makes it all the more interesting, folks. There were U.S. notes inserted into the U.S. economy during the administration of Lyndon Johnson. In fact, in one of the later editions of my book, Final Judgment, I actually reproduced one of those U.S. notes, and this U.S. note has been in the possession of a friend of mine who is a very big critic of the Federal Reserve, who's a very strong believer in U.S. notes. It's been in his possession for years and years and years. It's in almost mint condition. And it's funny, people said, oh, that had to be a fraud, that couldn't have been real, that it must have been some sort of counterfeit bill, that everybody knows that the U.S. notes were withdrawn from the economy by Lyndon Johnson. Quite the opposite, folks. Quite the opposite. And in fact, if you check on the internet right now, you probably find through currency dealers that you can buy very legitimate U.S. notes from the Lyndon Johnson era. Now, again, folks, this doesn't mean that the Kennedy family was not moving against the Federal Reserve. My late friend, DeWest Hooker, met with Joseph P. Kennedy in Palm Beach in the mid-1950s, introduced by the late, great Lawrence Dennis. The late, great Lawrence Dennis introduced them. And Joe Kennedy, the father of President Kennedy, and my friend DeWest Hooker played golf and then sat down for some serious political talk. I've talked about some of that discussion they had here. But among the things that Joe Kennedy said the Kennedy family intended to do was to break the back of the Jewish moneyed elite, the Rothschilds, once they got in the White House. That is, once John F. Kennedy got in the White House. And they were going to move against the Federal Reserve when it was possible. But JFK did not issue that executive order. And please, I know a lot of you are very upset about that right now. Don't call in here to tell me that he did, because he didn't. And no, I'm not covering up for the Federal Reserve, folks. I'm not covering up for the Federal Reserve. It goes on and on and on. It goes on and on and on. And now, I probably should mention another one of the myths that's out there. It's very, very interesting. This was actually published at Salon.com, which is a liberal pro-gun control site. They have published on January 11th an article entitled The Hitler Gun Control Lie. And they talk about the famous quote that Hitler supposedly said, "This year will go down in history. For the first time, a civilized nation has full gun registration. Our streets will be safer, our police more efficient, and the world will follow our lead into the future." You know what, folks? I first saw that quote back in the 1970s when I was in high school. Somebody wrote a letter to my local daily newspaper in Pennsylvania, a critic of gun control, and they quoted that Hitler quote, which this goes back to the 1970s, folks, which Hitler never said. And would you believe a kid in my high school saw that quotation in the paper and actually picked it up and broadcast it on the daily school broadcast? It was never true. The guy quoted here in this story says, this quotation, often seen without any date or citation at all, suffers from several credibility problems, the most significant of which is that the date often given, 1935, has no correlation with any legislative effort by the Nazis for gun registration, nor would there have been any need for the Nazis to pass such a law, since gun registration laws passed by the Weimar government were already in effect. However, this has not stopped critics of gun control from claiming that Hitler introduced gun control legislation, which he did not. This article points out here, the Weimar Republic, the German government that immediately preceded Hitler's, actually had tougher gun laws than the Nazi regime. In 1928, the Reichstag relaxed the regulation a bit, but put in place a strict registration regime that required citizens to acquire separate permits to own guns, sell them, or carry them. However, now listen to this, folks. Now, Wayne LaPierre of the NRA has put out this phony story about the Hitler gun control legislation. However, according to this writer here, and I've heard this from other sources, folks, the 1938 law signed by Hitler that LaPierre mentioned in his book does the opposite of what he says it did. Here's a quote from the author, Mr. Bernard Harcourt of the University of Chicago. He says, the 1938 revisions completely deregulated the acquisition and transfer of rifles and shotguns, as well as ammunition. Apparently, then, it goes on to say, meanwhile, many more categories of people, including Nazi party members, were exempted from gun ownership regulations altogether, while the legal age of purchase was lowered from 20 to 18, and permit lengths were extended from 1 year to 3 years. Folks, in the past, I have read a letter to the editor of the Spotlight, or a letter to the editor of American Free Press from an American veteran. Nice fellow. In fact, his wife's maiden name was Piper. He was in Germany as an American soldier at the end of the war, and he had great familiarity with the fact that German citizens did have firearms. He discussed it freely with people. So this story that's told by, Alex Jones, we heard him ranting and raving the other day. Oh, it's Piers Morgan. Oh, what an embarrassment. Maybe talk about that later. Maybe we shouldn't talk about that later. But again, this story that Hitler banned firearms and his famous quote, not true. A lot of stuff you hear about Mr. Hitler isn't true. This is one of those shows where I guarantee you I make enemies. by just forcing people to know the truth. Terrible job. It's a terrible, terrible job. You know, it'd be very... I could do like Alex Jones and play to the crowd like that foolish behavior he just displayed on Piers Morgan the other day. He didn't win any converts. He may have won a few converts. He missed it. Well, I won't go into that, folks. But no, the truth is important to me, folks. And I think it should be important to you. But as we've demonstrated here, it's not necessarily important to a lot of people. And there's a lot of people who, for reasons which are inexplicable to me, people refuse to accept the truth, even when hit over the head with it. So this show is kind of like a concentration camp. We're all concentrated here right now together, and I'm forcing you to concentrate. Those of you who need to concentrate.